I leaned against the kitchen counter, mindlessly stirring a steaming cup of coffee when the stillness of the night was broken by the sound of footsteps. It was close to midnight, and the entire house seemed to hold its breath, cloaked in darkness, only faintly illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights filtering through the windows. She entered the room slowly, almost hesitantly, as if she had a secret to reveal but was uncertain whether she should. My half-brother, stepsister, or just my stepsister, as everyone casually referred to her, stopped a few feet away from me. Her face was partly shrouded in shadow, but her eyes were locked onto mine with an intensity that left me unsettled. The sudden silence felt heavy between us. We had crossed paths countless times in this house since our parents married, always exchanging friendly banter or light conversation about school, work, or whatever trivial topics came to mind. But this moment felt different. An unspoken and electric tension filled the air, and I couldn't shake it off, even as I tried to look away. Then she broke the silence, her voice barely more than a whisper, shattering the stillness like glass. "We need to talk," she said, her tone more serious and softer than I had ever heard. Fidgeting with her hands, she twisted her fingers together, seemingly gathering the courage to continue. Her words came out hesitantly, almost painfully, and I couldn't recall the last time I'd seen her so exposed. There was no easy smile or playful spark in her eyes, only an uncertainty that flickered in the dim light. A chill crept up my spine as I stared at her, unsure how to react. Part of me wanted to brush it off, to laugh at the awkwardness, but something in her expression stopped me. It was as if she were teetering on the edge of a cliff, poised to leap, needing just a slight push to do so. The moment was shocking, almost surreal, and I felt my heart race as the gravity of the situation sank in. I wasn't ready for this. Whatever this was, what's going on? I finally managed to ask, keeping my voice steady despite the thickening tension. I knew my question might be futile. The look on her face indicated this was significant, something that had been brewing for longer than I had imagined. As I waited for her response, I noticed a slight tremor in her hand, a hesitation that heightened the intensity of the moment. She didn't respond. Her gaze fell to the floor, lips pressed together as if the words were stuck deep inside, resisting any attempt to break free. Then, with a soft exhale, she met my eyes again. Her gaze was piercing, almost pleading, and I felt an invisible weight settle on my chest. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice so low it was almost inaudible. The urgency in her tone sent a shiver down my spine. I was used to seeing her as a friend, someone I had grown comfortable with over time, but the vulnerability on her face was a new sight, one that made me want to reach out and comfort her, even though I had no clue what she was dealing with. I fought to remain calm, resisting the urge to jump to conclusions. Yet the air around us was thick with unexpressed thoughts. I felt myself getting drawn into the weight of her confession, even though I still had no idea what she intended to reveal. My mind raced, sifting through fragments of past conversations, searching for any hint that could explain her visible distress. But I found nothing. The silence stretched between us, my breath catching and my heart beating steadily in my chest. I longed to say something, anything, to relieve the tension, but words eluded me. Instead, I simply nodded, trying to signal that I was listening, that I was present even if I didn't fully comprehend. Finally, she stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "I've been holding on to this for a while now," she said, her voice just above a whisper, "and it's been tearing me apart inside. I don't know if I should even be saying this," but her voice trailed off, and for a moment, I thought she might turn and leave me with a flood of unanswered questions. Yet, she took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for what was to come. She paused again, her expression intense, a mix of guardedness and vulnerability that made it impossible for me to look away. The words that finally spilled from her lips struck me harder than I anticipated, sending ripples through me like a sudden gust of wind. "I think I have feelings for you," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. The shock of her admission hung in the air, filling the silence with a weight I couldn't ignore. The following day, I couldn't shake off her words. Even as I tried to immerse myself in work and push everything aside, she had revealed feelings I never saw coming, emotions that transformed our connection into something I couldn't quite define. Even hours later, the tension loomed around me like a shadow. Around midday, I sprawled across the couch, phone pressed to my ear, my friend on the other end chatting about his latest project. I nodded along, hardly registering half of what he said, when suddenly she walked into the room. Her expression was softened by an amused, almost playful smile. I kept my gaze fixed on her, utterly captivated, even as I struggled to follow my friend's conversation. She nestled beside me, close enough that I could sense her presence. Before I realized what was happening, her fingers playfully danced around my sides, darting in teasing motions. I jolted in surprise, trying to suppress a laugh as her fingers discovered those ticklish spots I had long tried to ignore. I feigned a shrug, mumbling a strained, "Hang on, I'm just on the phone," attempting to keep a serious expression. Her laughter was soft, and her eyes sparkled as if she relished the effect she was having on me. Relentlessly, she continued, her fingers light and playful, making it nearly impossible for me to concentrate on anything else. Eventually, I succumbed, chuckling softly as I mouthed, "Stop that." She completely ignored my plea, meeting my gaze with an intimacy that felt dangerously familiar, like a line I wasn't ready to cross. By the time I managed to end the call with my friend, my heart raced faster than I wanted to admit. Turning to her, I mixed frustration and amusement in my voice. "You do realize I was on the phone, right?" I said, half joking but also attempting to mask the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. I couldn't quite explain what I was feeling. She tilted her head, her gaze steady, a smirk playing on her lips. "I couldn't resist," she replied softly, her tone casual. Yet there was an undercurrent that hinted at the conversation we had shared the night before. Once again, the air between us crackled with energy, and I could sense the shift, the same undeniable tension I had felt when she first walked into the room yesterday. It was an awareness that drew me in, leaving me to wonder where all of this was leading. She didn't pull away. Instead, she stayed close, her eyes unwavering, her hand lingering on my arm for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then, almost without thinking, I leaned in, barely realizing I was closing the gap until our faces were just inches apart. My thoughts raced, colliding in a chaotic whirlwind within those few seconds. This was the moment to retreat, to laugh it off, to say something that would ease the intensity, but I found myself unable to do so. Caught between the urge to pull back or give in, I was struck speechless. Before I could even comprehend the choice, our lips met in a brief, tender kiss that seemed to silence every doubt and reason I had held onto for why this shouldn't happen. It wasn't a kiss laden with promises or grand declarations. It was tentative, as if we were both navigating through an unfamiliar territory. Her breath mingled with mine, and for that fleeting moment, the world outside shrank to nothing, as if there were no one and nothing beyond the confines of this room. Just the two of us. The reality of what we had done hung in the air between us, an unspoken acknowledgement neither of us dared to voice. When we finally broke apart, she looked at me, her cheeks slightly flushed. Her expression was a blend of uncertainty and something deeper I couldn't quite identify. I searched her face, grasping for the right words, but they eluded me, lost somewhere in the thrill of the moment and the realization of what we had just crossed into. "We probably shouldn't have done that," I mumbled, my voice barely above a whisper, as if trying to convince myself more than her. My heart was still racing, the sensation of her lips lingering like a brand I couldn't erase. She glanced away, a faint smile tugging at her lips, her voice barely a murmur. "Probably not," she agreed. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the edge of the couch cushion for a moment. Neither of us moved, ensnared by the weight of what had just unfolded. And yet, I couldn't overlook the unspoken understanding in her gaze, a silent admission that perhaps this wasn't the conclusion. The silence between us felt charged, as if we were teetering on the brink of something significant that had been brewing longer than either of us had realized. I felt torn, yearning to pull her close once more, yet fully aware that every step deeper into this could complicate things in ways I wasn't ready to confront. Finally, she met my gaze, the corners of her lips curling into a small, teasing smile. "Well, I guess you'll have to get used to having me around," she said, a playful note in her voice, though her eyes conveyed a seriousness that sent another thrill through me. There was no telling what lay ahead, but in that moment, as we sat there, so close yet so uncertain, I understood there was no turning back to how things had been. We had crossed a boundary, and the only question remaining was whether we were prepared to face the repercussions. In the days that followed, it felt as though everything had changed, yet we both acted as if nothing out of the ordinary had taken place. We navigated this new territory carefully, avoiding any mention of the kiss that lingered unspoken between us. Still, the memory caught me off guard during quiet moments, making me second-guess every glance, every smile. I found myself observing her more intently, noticing small details I had somehow overlooked. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the playful smirk she wore when she thought no one was watching, the way her laughter softened whenever I was near. I knew it was silly to be thinking about her this way, yet I couldn't help myself whenever we found ourselves in the same room. The air grew heavy with unspoken tension. I'd catch her glancing in my direction, and sometimes our eyes would meet, lingering just a heartbeat too long before one of us averted our gaze. Though I tried to brush it off, it was clear she felt the weight of it too. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, she strolled into the kitchen with a casual, familiar grin. Leaning against the counter, she watched me chop vegetables, and for a moment, everything felt surprisingly normal. Her presence was comforting, like we had silently agreed to keep things uncomplicated. But then, as I turned to grab a bowl, I noticed her reaching for the can of whipped cream I had set aside for dessert. I raised an eyebrow, amused. "Really? That's for later," I said, fully aware she'd ignore my warning. She simply laughed, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I couldn't help it," she said with a shrug, pressing the nozzle to create a little mound of cream on her finger before taking a quick taste. "Besides," she added, glancing up at me, "you know I can't resist this stuff." I rolled my eyes, but a smile tugged at my lips. She was so unapologetically herself, so full of confidence, that it was impossible to stay annoyed. "One day, I'll make you wait," I teased, pointing the spoon in her direction. "Or maybe I'll just stop sharing altogether." She stepped closer, narrowing her eyes playfully. "Oh, come on," she laughed. "You'd never hold out." Her tone was light, yet there was something in the way she looked at me that made me hesitate. A slight pause hung between us as the memory of our last kiss flashed back into my mind. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the sensation, but the tension only thickened. She turned and settled onto a bar stool across from me, launching into stories about her day, filling the air with light-hearted chatter. I listened, half paying attention, yet acutely aware of how close she was, how her presence seemed to envelop the room. Her laughter echoed around us, magnified in the small space, and the casualness of it felt like a stark contrast to the weight of my thoughts. Suddenly, she reached across the counter, lightly brushing my arm. Her fingers grazed my skin for just a moment, but it sent a shockwave through me, a reminder of everything left unsaid. She quickly withdrew her hand, but I caught the faint blush rising to her cheeks, and I knew she felt it too. I tried to play it cool, stirring the sauce on the stove, but I could sense her eyes on me, her gaze burning into my back. Eventually, I set the spoon down and turned to face her, unable to ignore the tension any longer. She looked up, surprised, and for a heartbeat, we just stared at each other. Neither of us seemed willing to take the first step. My heart raced, each thump echoing in the silence between us. "Are we just going to pretend it didn't happen?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The words slipped out before I could reconsider, and once they were out, there was no taking them back. Her expression softened as her eyes searched mine. "I don't know," she admitted, a small, almost wistful smile forming on her lips. "Maybe it's best if we don't talk about it." I wanted to argue, to insist that ignoring what had happened wasn't the answer, but the right words evaded me. Instead, I just nodded, caught in a strange mix of relief and disappointment. She turned her focus back to the whipped cream, taking another small taste, as if the sweetness could distract her from the rising tension. In that instant, I realized just how tangled things had become. We were navigating around something delicate, something that could shatter at any moment if we weren't careful. Yet, part of me didn't want to exercise caution. I wanted to let the tension build, to see where it would lead us, even if it meant risking everything. As we finished dinner, the atmosphere seemed to settle, though the unsaid words still lingered between us. She kept glancing my way, her smile lingering a bit too long, her laughter a touch too bright. I leaned into it, allowing her warmth to fill the gaps between us, as if that might simplify everything. Later that evening, while I was tidying up, she wandered back into the kitchen, looking almost shy. "Thanks for letting me eat half the dessert," she said, grinning, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "I owe you one." I shrugged, unable to suppress a smile that crept onto my face. "You can pay me back another time," I replied, trying to keep it light, though I knew the weight of what lay beneath our words. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor, and for a fleeting moment, I thought she might say more. Instead, she simply whispered a soft goodnight and turned to leave. Her footsteps were nearly silent against the floor as she slipped down the hall. The quiet enveloped me, leaving me alone with my thoughts, the memory of her laughter mingling with the bittersweet taste of everything left unspoken. A few days later, we found ourselves alone once more. This time, it was on a brisk autumn evening, with leaves swirling from the trees around us, dancing in gentle breezes that sliced through the stillness. We were meant to be running an errand, some obligatory family commitment that neither of us had any interest in attending. Yet, somehow, we had both managed to slip away. We found ourselves on a deserted park bench beneath a streetlight that cast a soft, inviting glow. The air was crisp and invigorating, as if it could stir to life all the emotions we had buried. That familiar tension settled over us again, palpable and hard to ignore. Despite our attempts to act casual, it was impossible to avoid. She chatted about something trivial, perhaps a recent movie she had seen or a funny anecdote about a friend. Her voice carried a lightness that felt forced, betraying her true feelings. I nodded along, responding automatically, but my mind drifted back over the past few weeks, replaying the moments we had shared and all the things we hadn't said. I could feel her gaze on me as she spoke, her eyes intense, as if she was waiting for something to happen, though I couldn't tell what that might be. Eventually, her words faded, leaving only the gentle sounds of the evening around us. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and fiddled with her scarf, her discomfort evident. I knew we were both thinking about the same unspoken issue hanging over us. The silence thickened, heavy with everything we hadn't expressed, and I could feel my heart racing, an anxious rhythm of anticipation and fear. After what felt like an eternity, I took a deep breath and finally broke the silence. "We need to talk about everything that's been going on," I started, my voice trembling with uncertainty. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening." She lowered her gaze, her face softening into a look that was almost vulnerable, a stark contrast to her usual self-assuredness. I felt a pang of guilt, as if I were cornering her. But then she looked back up, meeting my eyes with a resolve I hadn't expected. "I know," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, "but I'm not sure what to do." There was a sadness in her tone that echoed my own feelings of helplessness. "Maybe it's easier if we just pretend nothing happened," she suggested, though her lack of conviction was clear. I shook my head, frustration bubbling up inside me. "How can we pretend?" I asked, my voice rising. Whatever this is, it's real. We can't just ignore it and act like it doesn't matter." My words hung in the air, sharp against the stillness of the night, and immediately I regretted the edge in my tone. She flinched, her expression hardening. "Do you think I haven't considered that?" she snapped, her voice tinged with frustration. "Do you really think I don't realize how complicated this is?" Her words hit me hard, and I took a step back, feeling the weight of everything we had been avoiding. The hurt in her eyes made me aware of how deeply this affected us both, how we had been trying to overlook something that refused to be ignored. She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself, as if shielding against the cold. For a moment, it looked like she might walk away to escape this conversation altogether. But then she turned back, her gaze softer, more exposed than I had ever seen it. Maybe we just need to be honest, she whispered, her voice trembling. No more pretending. The vulnerability in her words broke through my defenses, and before I knew it, I stepped closer. Her breath caught in her throat as I reached out for her hand, our fingers intertwining in a way that felt both familiar and new. The distance between us vanished, replaced by the warmth of her hand in mine, a quiet intimacy enveloping us. Without saying a word, I leaned in, and our lips met in a kiss that was tender and tentative, as if we were both testing the waters of this fragile connection. It was nothing like our first kiss. This one felt grounded and real, as though we were finally acknowledging the truth we had both been evading. Her lips were soft and warm against mine, and I could feel her heartbeat in sync with my own, a steady rhythm that calmed my racing thoughts. We pulled away slowly, our foreheads resting against each other, neither of us eager to break the silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. This is a mess, isn't it?" she said, a soft laugh escaping her, tinged with both sadness and relief. A faint smile formed on my lips in response. "Yeah," I replied, my voice equally soft. "But maybe it doesn't have to be." The words felt both reassuring and uncertain, like a fragile promise we weren't sure we could fulfill. For a while, we remained there, lost in the comfortable silence of each other's company, as if the outside world had faded away, leaving just the two of us in that stolen moment. However, reality gradually crept back in, reminding us of the precariousness of our situation. She pulled away slightly, her expression distant. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice heavy with a sadness that tugged at my heart. "It's too complicated. People wouldn't understand." I wanted to argue, to insist that we could find a way to make it work. But the words caught in my throat. I knew she was right. No matter how much I wanted to believe we could navigate this, the obstacles felt insurmountable, the risks too high. Yet I couldn't bring myself to let her go. "I don't have all the answers," I admitted quietly. "But I do know that I don't want to lose what we have." "Lose you?" She looked at me, her eyes brimming with an emotion I struggled to decipher. For a brief moment, I thought she might say something that would clarify everything swirling around us. But instead, she sighed, a soft, resigned sound that pierced through me like a knife. "We'll figure it out," she said, though her tone was tinged with uncertainty. "Or maybe we won't." The words escaped her lips laced with bitterness, the hollow sound settling heavily between us. The night air turned colder, a sharp reminder of the reality we couldn't escape. We stood on the precipice of something vast and uncharted, and I understood that whatever lay ahead would change everything. As she gazed at me, her expression was a mixture of hope and fear. I felt the weight of what we were risking, the delicate nature of the bond we were struggling to maintain. In that moment, I wanted to confess everything. How much she meant to me, how desperately I wanted us to make this work. Instead, I simply reached out and took her hand again, offering the comfort I could. "Whatever happens," I said, my voice steady, "we'll face it together." Her grip tightened around my hand, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like that would be enough. Yet as we stood there, enveloped in the quiet of the night, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. It wasn't long before our parents suggested a family getaway, one of those spontaneous ideas they thought would help us reconnect and create memories, free from daily distractions. I realized we couldn't decline without raising suspicion, so we agreed. The thought of spending an entire weekend together, confined to the same house, felt both like a blessing and a burden. I told myself we'd keep our distance, navigate through the weekend without dropping our guard. But deep down, I understood it wouldn't be that easy. The weekend kicked off awkwardly. The house was a charming, secluded cabin by a lake, its rustic appeal casting a tranquil hush over us that only intensified the tension. The first night, we all sat together, our parents laughing and reminiscing about old stories we'd heard countless times before. She and I exchanged polite glances, maintaining the familiar distance we had practiced over the past few days. Yet I couldn't help but steal glances at her now and then. I saw the same hesitation, the same magnetic pull that kept drawing us back together. I knew she felt it too. The second day unfolded with activities our parents planned to bring us closer, or so they thought. By mid-afternoon, we had hiked through the nearby woods, played board games by the fire, and exchanged more forced laughter than I thought possible. The effort to maintain a facade of normalcy was exhausting. The tension simmered beneath every word, every look we shared. She stayed close to our parents, her laughter genuine enough to deceive them. But every so often, I would catch a flicker in her eyes that hinted she was just as anxious as I was. That evening, after dinner, we managed to sneak away, retreating to the quiet shadows of the garden just outside the cabin. The air was crisp, infused with the scent of pine, and the night was cloaked in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional chirp of crickets. For a while, we stood side by side without speaking, watching as the sky deepened and stars began to twinkle into view. I took a deep breath and broke the stillness. This weekend has been tougher than I anticipated. She nodded, her gaze distant, a faint crease forming on her brow. I thought I could handle it, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. But every time I look at you, it's like I can't breathe. I feel like I don't even know who I am anymore when I'm with you. Her words struck me more profoundly than I expected, flooding me with a confusing mix of relief and sorrow. I reached out, my fingers brushing against hers, a tentative touch that felt as fragile as the moment itself. Maybe we're just trying too hard to pretend, I said softly, hoping that voicing it would somehow ease our situation. She turned to face me, her expression caught between the emotions swirling within us. "But what else can we do?" she asked. "This isn't something we can explain away. Every time I try to act normal, it feels like I'm betraying both myself and you." Her gaze held steady, her eyes reflecting the dim light from the cabin, and I could see that she was as trapped in this situation as I was. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps approaching from the cabin made us pull apart instantly. Our conversation was abruptly halted, and we resumed our roles, donning masks of casual indifference. The moment had slipped away, along with the fleeting comfort of our honesty. Later that night, everyone turned in early, worn out from the day's activities. I tried to sleep, lying awake in my room, staring at the ceiling while feeling the weight of all that remained unsaid. My mind was a jumble, replaying every glance, every whispered exchange we had shared. I knew I couldn't keep navigating this fine line between desire and denial. Yet the reality of our situation loomed like a dark shadow, reminding me that whatever choices we made, consequences would follow. Just when I thought I would spend the entire night wrestling with my thoughts, I heard a soft knock at my door. I held my breath, already knowing who was at the door before I even opened it. There she stood, outlined against the dim light of the hallway, her expression inscrutable. She remained silent, and there was no need for words. We both understood the reason for her visit and why the pretense could no longer continue. I let her in, gently closing the door behind us. For a brief moment, we stood facing each other in the soft glow, the unspoken tension hanging thickly in the air, my pulse racing as I absorbed the reality of her being there. She stepped closer, and in that confined space, it felt as though the world outside faded away, leaving just the two of us. The unspoken agreement was clear. We had reached a point of no return. I reached out, our hands connecting, fingers intertwining. It felt like a release, a surrender to something we had resisted for far too long. She lifted her gaze to meet mine, her eyes steady, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she leaned in, and our lips met in a kiss that encapsulated everything we had left unspoken. Every moment we had concealed came rushing forth. The kiss was neither hurried nor desperate. Instead, it was serene, as if we were finally embracing the truth that had loomed between us from the start. Her warmth enveloped me, anchoring me in a way that made everything else blur for that brief, stolen moment. It was just the two of us, shielded from the outside world, from the doubts and fears that had kept us apart. When we finally broke away, she looked at me, her eyes brimming with a mix of hope and sorrow. Words weren't necessary. The silence spoke volumes. The expression in her eyes communicated more than any words could convey. This moment was real, yet it felt impossible. We both recognized that even as we clung to each other in the quiet darkness, there was no turning back. Eventually, she stepped back, her fingers slipping from mine, and I felt a sharp pang of loss as the distance between us grew once more. She offered a faint, bittersweet smile, and I understood that she too felt the weight of the inevitability that hung between us. There was no reversing what had occurred, yet the thought of moving forward seemed equally daunting. "Good night," she whispered, her voice scarcely above a murmur. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, the soft click of the door echoing in the silence as I remained alone in the stillness of the room. The gravity of what had transpired settled upon me, heavy and unyielding. We had crossed a line, one that could neither be undone nor ignored. Deep down, I understood that there would be no simple solutions or ways to reverse the choices we had made. All I could do was hope that we might find a way to confront what lay ahead, even as the burden of uncertainty loomed over us like a storm cloud poised to break. I came to realize that love, no matter how intense, didn't always present clear paths or guarantee happy endings. Sometimes it consisted of a series of impossible decisions, leaving us to piece together the fragments of what we had shattered along the way. Returning to the city felt peculiar, as though the world had shifted, leaving us stranded between reality and all the unspoken words. Days passed, each one dragging on with the weight of distance. We had breached a boundary that I thought might draw us closer, yet it seemed to have pushed us into silence instead. The heaviness of our actions, along with everything we had left unaddressed, lingered in the air whenever we encountered one another, even in fleeting moments. I yearned to talk to her, to untangle this strange limbo we found ourselves in. But she appeared distant, her gaze slipping away each time I attempted to catch it. A new expression flickered across her face, something I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't anger, yet it wasn't the warmth I had grown accustomed to either. She was retreating, and I felt that absence like a growing loss each day, widening the gap between us. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, I texted her, asking if we could meet to talk. Hours went by without a reply. Finally, just past midnight, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was brief and direct, her tone colder than I had anticipated. "Meet me by the river." The river had always been our quiet refuge, a place where we'd wander during late-night conversations, sharing everything from dreams to family matters and everything in between. But tonight felt different. The night air was crisp, and the world seemed enveloped in stillness. As I stood alone beneath the soft glow of the street lamps reflecting off the water, I saw her approaching, her steps slow and tentative. A mix of anticipation and fear coursed through me. She halted a few feet away, her hands tucked into her pockets, eyes cast downward. For a moment, we remained silent. Then she raised her gaze, her face shrouded in shadow as she searched my eyes. The quiet felt like an insurmountable chasm. "We need to end this," she finally said, her voice barely rising above the sound of the river beside us. Her words struck me like a punch, and I felt my chest tighten, a hollow ache settling deep within. "What do you mean?" I asked, though deep down I already understood the answer. She took a steadying breath, her eyes clear yet filled with sadness. Whatever we have, it's not something we can keep doing. I had hoped we might find a way forward, but she added, "It's just too overwhelming for both of us." Frustration and desperation washed over me, and I shook my head in disbelief. "We don't have to end it like this. We can work through it," I insisted. "I can't just pretend this never happened." She looked away, her expression hardening into something more resolute. Maybe that's the issue. Perhaps we're both just holding on to something that's not meant to be. Her voice was sharp, but a slight tremor betrayed her emotions. I stepped closer, trying to take her hand, but she withdrew, crossing her arms protectively. The gap between us felt insurmountable, like an invisible barrier she had constructed over time. I felt utterly powerless against it. "I can't keep doing this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought I could manage, but it's tearing me apart. We're hurting not just ourselves, but each other too." Her eyes shimmered with raw emotion, barely contained. For a moment, I was at a loss for words. I wanted to argue, to express that we could make it work, that what we had was worth fighting for. Yet, her expression told me she had already reached a conclusion. She looked at me as if she had accepted something I was still resisting, and that realization felt like a knife twisting in my chest. "Is this truly what you want?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. She nodded, swallowing hard, her eyes revealing more than her words. "This is what we need," she replied firmly. "We can't keep pretending this won't ultimately destroy us." There was a finality in her voice that made it hard to breathe. I felt the weight of all we had shared pressing down on me. The memories, the stolen moments, the quiet nights filled with whispered thoughts. Standing there, it all seemed to slip through my fingers, leaving behind only the pain of what might have been. "I don't know how to let you go," I confessed, my voice quivering, the vulnerability I had worked so hard to suppress now spilling out in those simple words. She offered a sorrowful smile, one that reflected regret and understanding. "Maybe we don't have a choice in this." Her words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Deep down, I knew she was right, even as my heart resisted the truth. She took a step back, and the distance between us widened, her expression a mix of resolve and heartbreak. Just as she was about to turn away, she glanced back, her gaze lingering as if she wanted to etch that moment in her memory, to hold on to something of what we had shared. But it all slipped away. As she walked off, the reality of it hit me like a wave, leaving a hollow ache in the void she left behind. I stood there, the chill of the night air stinging my skin, watching her figure disappear into the shadows, feeling like I was losing a part of myself in the silence that enveloped me. I felt the weight of all the words left unsaid, the choices we hadn't made, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was the destined conclusion, ending with unspoken feelings and roads not taken. Her presence, her voice echoed faintly in my mind, a lingering reminder of what we once had. As I turned to leave, a question nagged at me, relentless and haunting. Was it truly better to have loved and lost, or had we been naive to believe we could redefine the boundaries that had always existed between us? The answer slipped away from me, just as she had, leaving me to contemplate whether love, in all its glory and heartache, was ever truly meant to be ours to keep.